You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello Book Talk Today family, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Talk Today podcast. My name is Orn, I am your host, and in today's podcast we are joined by Richard Eaton. Richard is an American historian currently working as a professor of history at the University of Arizona. He is known for having written the notable books on Indian history before 1800. In this conversation we discussed his most recent book, India in the Persianate Empire between the years 1000 to 1765, a rather large time period, but it was a very interesting conversation as someone whose grandfather was born in India and someone who has heritage spanning dating back to this time, should I say. And it was a very interesting conversation, one that at times was very interesting, based on this idea that the Persianate Empire was one that embedded itself within India at the time. And people might just think that Persian or Persianate is just a language. It's just something that originated as a language. But in our conversation with Richard, he talks about how it became a layer on top of the culture and it embedded itself. At one point being that more books were translated and made at that time in Persian than in the native Sanskrit-based languages. And it was a very interesting conversation, and like I said, one that I have some heritage in as well. At times it did get quite complicated, but it was very interesting as well, if you're someone who's interested in this topic. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the podcast. Every single week we release a podcast with an author to discuss their book and the ideas and principles inside of it. We've got some really interesting conversations lined up in the coming weeks, so I definitely recommend subscribing, whether you're listening to this on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. The best way to support this channel is to head over to our YouTube channel and subscribe there. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast again, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Richard. Richard, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're welcome. And this topic is one of particular interest to me, given that my grandfather was born in India and we come from a Muslim heritage. So I feel like this book and this topic is perhaps in my genealogy, and I have some DNA linked to it. Good. So it was really interesting reading the book and to get a bit more of an idea around the history throughout that period. So just to start off with, I think it'd be great for you just to give a bit of a background about your experience with this subject and how you came to write this book.
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. Well, I actually got interested in this. I suppose you could say I was interested in ever since I first went to India and Pakistan back in the early 60s when I was living in Iran. And I was there for 2 years in Tabriz. And I was, of course, learning the language and the culture. And I was fortunate to make a trip with 2 other Peace Corps volunteers from Tehran all the way to, well, all of India, really, through Pakistan and Afghanistan, hitchhiking and third-class trains and whatnot, as far south as Madras and as far east as Calcutta, then all the way back through Pakistan and Afghanistan. And in the course of that one trip, I became very struck by the similarities and the contrasts between what I was seeing in India and Pakistan on the one hand, and what I was already familiar with, having lived for a year already in Iran. So I was, for a long time, I've been interested in thinking about how Iran and South Asia relate to each other historically. And I was struck by the things like the architecture, the Urdu language, the cuisine, with all these Persian words everywhere, which I was not prepared for. I mean, I knew nothing about South Asia at that time, nothing, and so, so it was a real eye opener, and especially the large Muslim population. I was not aware there were any Muslims in India when I went there. So I became interested in. My first thing I was interested in is understanding conversion. I mean, where did all these Muslims come from? How did this happen? And as you might know, I went ahead and wrote several books dealing with different parts of South Asia. First of all, in the Deccan, at Bijapur, and then later in Punjab. I spent a year living in Lahore, and then finally in Bengal, where I worked in both Calcutta and Bangladesh, leading to a book on the rise of Islam in the Bengal frontier. Um, well, and then it's a long story, but essentially, I went from one project to another, and finally, I became dismayed with looking at India only through the lens of religion, uh, and I came to the conclusion that that was not a adequate way to think about the long history of South Asia, at least beginning from the Ghurids and Ghaznavid period and the founding of the Delhi Sultanate. Um, I was asked by Penguin UK to write a textbook of India between 1000 and the coming of the British, which, as you probably know, is one of the most controversial periods of all in South Asian history, including the British period, for that matter. So and that's when I began searching for some other way to conceptualize this very rich history of South Asia between 1000 and say 1800, other than simply looking at the very familiar trope of Hindu-Muslim relations, which I have come to see as largely an attempt to project backwards the partition of 1947, when British India became two separate countries, as we all know, with religion being the criterion. And it was because of that, I think, that I began searching for some other way of thinking about how to conceptualize this rich period. And I hit upon this idea of the Persianate and the Persianate Age as a means which I feel is far more encompassing, and it's far more accurate, actually. Because if you look at original sources dating back all the way to the 12th century in Sanskrit, Muslims were not called Muslims. They were called Turushka, or Turk. And that already is a signal that we need to look at this question more closely. And so one thing led to another, including the discovery that even the word Sharia, Islamic law, was not really understood as exclusively Islamic law until the 19th century, till the British came. It was the word Sharia simply meant valid or legal, and it was used more often by Hindus than it was by Muslims. So all of these things and many more things alerted me that we needed to rethink the traditional way in which so-called medieval Indian history has been construed, which has been, of course, the story of Hindu-Muslim relations, usually in a very negative way, conflict. Again, by way of seeing all of, or much of Indian history as a long, dismal prologue to 1947.
Yeah, I think that's sometimes the way that it's projected. Sometimes when you read about it, especially from the position that I sit in the UK, I think sometimes you read about it from that position, and I think there's some revisionist history that wants to be made to say that everything there was bad and this type of stuff. I'd love to actually hear a bit more about your experience of living in Iran during that time, because that must have been an eye-opening experience for you personally.
Oh, it was. I had just graduated from college with a degree in philosophy, actually, not history, and certainly not anything dealing with Islam or Iranian past. Although my parents happened to be living in Iran at that time. My father was a doctor in Mashhad, and my mother helped run the hospital that they were managing. And so I was already getting family letters for about 5 years, all the time that I was in college, from Iran. And I was also aware that my great-grandfather had gone out to Persia, as it was then called, in 1872 as a Presbyterian missionary. He was there for 20 years. And I always wondered, what was that all about? Uh, what is this business of trying to convert Muslims to Christianity or anything? Uh, and for that matter, what
Yeah.
does conversion mean? And
Yeah.
I didn't really consciously think about that problem until I went to India, as I said earlier, and discovered all these Muslims there. So I think part of my own family background, uh, which has a very deep history. I was the fourth generation to live in Iran for a long period of time, beginning with my great grandparents who were in Urumia in Azerbaijan for those 20 years. And my grandmother was born there, and then both my parents lived there for 10 years. Um, and then I went there. So, in a sense, there's a long family history of my connection with Iran. And then it was a sheer joy to have the privilege of living in Tabriz, a great city, uh, where I immersed myself in the culture and the language. Um, which is why when I went to India and Pakistan, it was such an eye-opening experience to see. I mean, when you've already been to Isfahan or Shiraz, and then you go see the Taj Mahal, you immediately see a direct connection there, and there's a shock of recognition. So my approach to South Asia is very different from most American scholars who study this part of the world, who come at it studying perhaps, either Islamic history or Hinduism, perhaps, or they become fascinated with yoga, or they listen to the Beatles. I mean, there's all kinds of ways of getting interested in South Asia, but it's not usually done through Iran. And so and I literally took a train to Pakistan, uh, to quote Khushwant Singh. I literally did that from Iran, from Zahedan across Baluchistan to Quetta and Karachi, and then from there on to Bombay and through. So
Yeah.
that's the brief background, I think, that you.
It seems like your experience on the ground and your trips and your family history played a massive part in shaping how you
Indeed,
view the history and in writing the book.
indeed, very much. That's true.
So just to go on the actual some of the topics in the book, something that really interested me was this idea of the Persianate era, shaping India to this day, and sort of the period in time in which we see India today being shaped by the what Persia was back then.
Yes, I mean that's a very important point. I mean, to take only one index, which is lexicon, vocabulary, you can look at almost any language of contemporary vernacular language in South Asia and find an enormous vocabulary of Persian words. Uh, this is true not just in North India, but across the South as well. Uh, I mean, Marathi, uh, as late as the 17th century, it's been estimated that something like 40% of the vocabulary used by upper caste Marathis was Persian. And the same is true with Hindi, and obviously with Urdu, but both of them, for that matter. Uh, I mean, it's a great irony. Several years ago, Prime Minister Modi uh, declared that Indian history from ever since 1100, from 1000 forward, was 1200 years of slavery, which is a remarkable comment. But the irony of that remark was that one quarter of the words that he used in the paragraph in which he said that, one quarter, 25%, were pure Persian words. And so people,
Where did that statement originate from?
it was a speech that he gave. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe it was at the Red Fort, which is another irony. Uh, and I'm not quite sure the occasion, but I can look that up for you if you want to know. But
Okay.
he spoke of that. Yeah, Baraso Salti Gulami, 1,200 years of slavery, uh, was the term, and it's I only cite that to draw attention to the deep penetration of Persian vocabulary in everyday spoken Hindi and Urdu. And of course, the same is true in Bengali. I had the pleasure of living in Bangladesh for several years and studying Bangla. And that was even more surprising to find how deeply embedded Persian is in ordinary Bengali vocabulary. And what's interesting is Persian came into Bengal, of course, in the 12th century, 13th century. And then Bengal became isolated from North India. You had an independent sultanate there for several hundred years until the Mughals conquered the area in the 17th century. But what's interesting is that the vocabulary, much of the Persian vocabulary in Bengali, is archaic. It dates back to the 12th century, 13th century. That words like teacup in Bengali would be piala, which has not been used. Nobody says that in modern Iran. It's in classical poetry you'll find it,
but in Urdu you find it as
there,
well.
There are thousands of words like this. So that became another eye opener to me just looking at vocabulary, apart from many other aspects of culture, you can see this very profound influence of Persian on India, which has such deep roots, so much so that people are not even conscious of it. And that's what I think is significant.
Yeah, you mentioned something in the book as well. You talked about Timur's invasion of Delhi in the 15th century and said that during that time came in that period, there was more Persian dictionaries produced in India than Iran during that period, just because of that invasion.
Yeah, and this is interesting because, Persian today is largely seen as an exclusively or near exclusively Iranian language. Of course, it is the official language and the national language of Iran. But the rise of nationalism in the 19th century really meant that Persian and Persian poetry and much of the Persian literary tradition became appropriated by Iran for its own nationalist project. For example, the tomb of Ferdowsi, which is the great poet, author of the Shanahmeh, the Book of Kings, his tomb outside of Mashhad, which I've visited several times, is an exact imitation of the tomb of Cyrus the Great near Persepolis in southern Iran, and that was all patronized by Reza Shah Pahlavi in the early 20th century, when he was trying to assimilate not just Cyrus into Iran's nationalist project, but also Ferdowsi. And Ferdowsi, of course, spent most of his time living in Afghanistan, patronized by Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni. And so you can see then how the Persian language has been kind of identified as an Iranian thing. And that distorts the truth, which is that if you look before the rise of nationalism in Iran or in India or anywhere, Persian was not understood as an exclusively ethnic language. It was something that was widely shared, not just only across India, but indeed across the Silk Road, all the way to China, where it was the official foreign language in the Yuan dynastic period. So my book, in other words, is trying to recover this world that still lives today in things like, as I said, vocabulary and dress and customs and food and so forth, architecture, but which is not consciously understood as alive in the same way that it was before nationalism. So the rise of nationalism has really kind of sealed off this awareness of the very deep Persian presence in South Asia, and has made it more of an Iranian thing, where, as you point out, more dictionaries were produced in India than Iran, not just dictionaries, but more literature. For the
Mm.
simple reason that there were many more people in India, uh, pre-modern India, than there were ever in Iran. The ratio, the population between India and Iran historically has been roughly 10 to 1.
And it's easy to forget how much of an impact that production of literature can have at that period of time, because people don't have ulterior forms of communication
Right.
really than that we do today. So when something's being produced at that mass scale, it does permeate to different parts of to different countries and through different people.
Exactly. And I would say, again, that ratio of 10 to 1, the population ratio of South Asia to Iranian plateau, that is what dictated the migration of so many poets from Iran to India. Because if you are an up and coming poet and you want to get patronized, you're going to go to a court that's got a lot more money and is much richer
Yeah.
than Iran. It's very simple. And there's more courts. You have lots of courts across South Asia, many more than in Iran. So you see historically a long-term gravitation of literati, not just poets, but historians, chroniclers, architects, all kinds of educated people who were, there's almost, you could say, a brain drain, uh, long-term brain drain from Iran to South Asia.
Mm.
And again, because of the courts, so many wealthy courts that were attracting them. And the prestige that these people brought with them, courts were competing with each other for who had the most and the best poets. And so there you are. That explains a large part of the story right there.
Does the court culture originate from this idea that you talked about in the book about a move from religion to fairness in Persianate culture? Because you talk about like adl, which is like fairness, and that move to away from maybe religious teachings to focusing more on fairness under that period of time.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say there was ever a move away from religion. I would say, on the contrary, there was a move toward religion, uh, defining the 18th and 19th centuries, especially the 20th century, uh, as you have all these reform movements taking place, in the course of the 19th and 20th century. Uh, and that is a function of an expanding uh, base of literate base. People have more access to information. There's a public sphere that begins to exist in the 19th and 20th century that did not exist prior to that time. And when you have a public sphere, I mean, these are the ideas of people like Habermas. When you have a public sphere, there's competition. And especially when you have the electoral politics that the British Raj introduced, then people have a political stake in promoting their particular agenda and getting it into the public sphere. So religion becomes something that people are much more aware of as a personal identity with the advent of the British Raj and with the growth of this public sphere. And that simply did not exist in the 12th or 13th century. It was not there. So there
Mm.
was no move away. As I say, on the contrary, there was a move toward religion as a marker. Uh, the Persianate world was something that was beyond politics. It was a world informed by a canon of literature, not by any state or empire. So you have Persian speakers and Persian users extending all the way from the Balkans to Bengal, a vast swath of territory, um, where you have many states. So it's more proper to speak, I think, of a network of, of literati moving from place to place, books moving from place to place, across political frontiers, and that's what defines this political this Persianate world, not a state system. Indeed,
It's
yeah,
in,
in India you have many. The Persianate world extends across the whole of South Asia, whereas the so-called Muslim states only occupied part of South Asia.
and what impact do you think that nationalism has had in sort of looking back at history and rechanging how you see that? Because in the book you talked about like divisions in India today being traced back potentially to like Robert Sowell's book, coinciding with the rise in Indian nationalism. So do you think like the way in which nationalism is being seen today dictates how people see history?
Absolutely, yes. No doubt about it. Uh, I mean, that's what nationalism does. Nationalism encourages people to identify land, blood, and God, essentially. And when you put these three together, it's a very potent brew. And this is what I think is so important to understand. I mean, when the Nazi Germans went into battle in World War II, on their belts was inscribed "Gott mit uns," God is with us. Well, when you combine God with land, with religion and language, uh, that is what energizes people to identify territory with a particular ethnic community. And that's what a nation
Mm.
is. The word nation is derived from the Latin word natio, which means to be born. In other words, it's an ethnic word by definition. You are born into a community, and that community shares a common kinship.
Mm.
And so the idea of a nation uh, upends the idea of the Persian. The Persianate world was not a nation. It was not an ethnic group. It was a literary idea, and it was consisted of books, texts, which formed a canon. So everybody was familiar with the same canon, and this canon grew over time, beginning perhaps with Rudaki, already in the 10th century in Central Asia, in Bukhara, and then expanding vastly through Afghanistan. And the authors of this canon could be anywhere from Turkey. Rumi, for example, was in Konya, to Azerbaijan, as in Nizami, all the way across South Asia, Amir Khosrow, obviously. Uh, and so it's a trans-regional phenomenon. And in a sense, the idea of a nation is a much more confined, a much more constricted thing, because it's only looking at one ethnic group, those who conceive themselves as being born together in one kin group. Whereas what I'm talking about with the Persian world uh, is something that jumps across ethnic boundaries or state boundaries. And that is what distinguishes it from the modern conception of the nation. The rise of nationalism um, has kind of camouflaged or made us unaware of this earlier universe that was composed of and informed by literary traditions, not only Persian, of course, but Sanskrit. The whole idea, my idea of the Persianate world, is simply borrowed from a colleague of mine, Shelley Pollack, who has this understanding of a Sanskrit cosmopolis, which extends all the way from Kandahar, a Sanskrit word, through to Singapore, another Sanskrit word. And there you have this vast stretch of territory, uh, which is informed by a body of Sanskrit texts, which are all having a collective concern with establishing and sustaining both moral order and social order. And the argument of my book is that earlier Sanskrit world is then overlaid by a Persianate world, which is also a trans-regional language, as opposed to a vernacular language. A trans-regional language that extends, as I said earlier, from the Balkans to Bengal, uh, in a sense, all the way across the Silk Road to China, where you have Persian as a contact language. That means a language that was not a first language, but everyone knew it as a second or third language as a means of making contact with other people, for merchants especially.
Mm.
Uh,
Mm.
and so this idea of the Sanskrit world that Shelley Pollack formulated, I found very fruitful because it informed my understanding of a Persian cosmopolis or a Persian world. And what's extraordinary about South Asia is that South Asia is the place where the earlier Sanskrit world was overlaid by a later Persianate world, and then you have the mixing and interactions between these two trans-regional traditions occurring between roughly 1000 down to the 19th century.
Yeah, no, because it's interesting because once you study, well, reading your book or any book at the time, you understand that the Persianate, as you said, the vernacular, it spreads towards other countries. Like you mentioned, for instance, like at Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or those type of countries, people don't seem to think that they have anything to do with that type of like Persianate uh, vernacular or way of culture, whatever you want to see it. They almost think as that is completely something different. And reading your book and reading similar books like that makes you realize how far spread it actually
Well,
is.
one of the great ironies is that modern Persian did not originate in Iran. It's very important to remember that it originated in Central Asia, more specifically uh, under the patronage of Persian-speaking rulers in Bokhara, the Samanid dynasty, the Khandan-i-Samani. They were the ones who first made modern Persian the official language of the region, not Arabic. And that same model was followed by other dynasties. They were on the eastern edge of the Abbasid uh, Empire. And of course, it was passed on to the Ghaznavids and so forth, and on to India. Uh, so, and that's an important point because, again, Iranian nationalism would have you believe that Persian was a language, modern Persian was a language that began historically in Iran. And that's not quite true. It, the original incubation, as it were, of the language and the earliest poets, such as Rudaki, such as Ferdowsi, were patronized in Afghanistan or in Samarkand and Bukhara in Central Asia. Um, Again, nationalism has distorted that understanding in rather dramatic ways.
How much of an impact did the actual merchants have in that spread of sort of Persianate vernacular and that spread of information? Not only information and literati, as you said, but actual goods and services.
The role of merchants, you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, fortunately we can document this because merchants keep records, and states want to have merchants, bringing good stuff to them. So we can reconstruct the trade routes that overlap in very interesting ways the same routes that literati used to go from court to court, which is to say, the opening up trade routes brought with well, another point I have to make is that merchants are by definition trans-regional. The whole Silk Road, extending from China to the Mediterranean basin and passing through Central Asia, passing through the Iranian plateau, uh, and extending into South Asia as well. That entire region, that road, was composed of people who needed a contact language, as I mentioned earlier. So the contact language was Persian, which also happened to be a language of prestige. It also happened to be a language of administration. So that when states appeared, they found already at hand a language that had the vocabulary for running governments. And that's very important. The Arabs did not have that. The Arab conquest of Iranian plateau, the Arabs had no tradition of running an empire. And Arabic was more a language of religion and poetry, of course, but not of administration. So the Arabs, from the very beginning, leaned upon skilled Persian administrators who learned Arabic and ran the Abbasid Empire, or less much of it, at least ran the bureaucracy, uh, beginning from the 8th century forward. But it's the merchants, as you rightly point out, who carry this language to much further distances, not only east toward China, but north up the Volga Valley, the Kazan, reaching into Russia.
Mm.
There's a very important book that came out last year by Niall Green entitled The Persianate World. And he studies in that book, it's a very important book because each chapter of that book is written by a separate author who studies how this phenomenon we're talking about, how Persian language as a vehicle for commerce traveled all over the place into Southeast Asia, into China, into Russia, into the Balkans, into the Caucasus, of course, into Anatolia. And so basically you have a number of mechanisms by which this language achieved such extraordinary territorial reach. One of them was administration, because Persian was a language that had specialized vocabulary for managing revenue and government. Another was the prestige of the poetry, and which people learned, they assimilated, they copied, and so forth. And another one was the contact element. Merchants needed to contact with each other, and Persian fulfilled that role as well. So for all these reasons, it became a very widely spread phenomenon.
And what are some of the differences linguistically between Arabic and Persian? Because I think a lot of people think they're very similar, but in fact, they're very much
No, they're
not.
totally different. Well, the short answer is that Arabic linguistically is a Semitic language. So as a Semitic language, it shares roots with obviously with Hebrew. I lived in Jerusalem for a year and was constantly struck by how close Hebrew and Arabic were. Uh, and beyond that, you have Aramaic, Akkadian, all these languages of the ancient Middle East uh, were Semitic, totally unrelated to Indo-European languages, which came, of course, from the north and spread everywhere across Europe, across Iran, and finally into India. Um,
Mm.
by the so-called Aryans. Indeed, the word Iran is cognate with Aryan. Uh, Same
Okay.
idea. And then, of course, that
Yeah, yeah.
language in Sanskrit is simply the easternmost um, uh, language of that family, the Indo-European language family. So,
Mm.
so Arabic and Persian come from very different roots. Arabic from the Semitic, and Persian from the Indo-European. You can see that very readily. I mean, English words like father and mother are cognate with Persian pedar and madar, brother, baradar, and so forth. There's so many examples of how we can see the deep Indo-European roots of Persian, unlike Arabic. So
Yeah.
the the modern Persian, of course, does have an enormous Arabic vocabulary, um, probably larger than most Iranians would like to admit. Uh,
How much of a factor did the religion play in that, though? Because obviously the main,
well,
I wouldn't say, because the Quran is written in Arabic. I know it is translated into different languages, but how much of a factor did that play?
well, it's no question that in the early centuries after the conquest is in the mid 8th century, uh, mid 7th century rather. 641 was the great Battle of Nahawan, which is analogous to the Battle of Hastings, when French suddenly kind of invades England, and you have this imposition of French on top of Anglo-Saxon. And then it took another 200 years, 300 years before you get Chaucer, before it becomes uh, proper to start writing in this new hybrid language. Even though people have been speaking a kind of an early hybrid ever since the Battle of Hastings, English and French began to mix, but it did become respectable to write in this new language, English, modern English, until Chaucer, and then until another couple hundred years until you get to Shakespeare, right? So the same thing with modern Persian. Initially, or Middle Persian, I should say, the language of the Sasanian dynasty, Middle Persian and Arabic were like oil and water, totally different, totally separate, coming from different language families. But over the course of 200 years, 300 years, they began to mix. People were speaking a language that which we call modern Persian, and it took 300 years until that became respectable to write literature in. Like that happens with Rudaki in the 10th century, and another couple hundred years before you get really classic literature. When you think of, Ferdowsi, Nizami, and so forth. So the answer your question, religion had much to do with it, obviously, because with Islam displacing the Zoroastrian religion in Iran, it meant that obviously a great deal of vocabulary is coming in, but not just religious vocabulary. Obviously, Arabic had a great deal of prestige in education. So that abstract nouns in modern Persian are oftentimes Arabic, whereas the table talk, ordinary speech of common, everyday usage, especially in the villages, are more likely to be pure Persian. And that's the same thing with English. Every time you open your mouth in English language, you have a choice of using either a French or an Anglo-Saxon word. Uh, you can say a home, you can say house, or you can say a domain. Domain is French, house is German, and so forth. Uh,
Yeah. I don't know how many right wing English people would like
right. I
that.
mean, you're not conscious of it. I mean, we know about this
Yeah, I
today,
know.
but that some writers were. Hemingway, for example, the great American writer, very consciously used Anglo-Saxon words and not French. Um,
What was his
oh,
reasoning?
it's a very different register of language when you're using more French vocabulary. You are distinguishing yourself in terms of social class in ways that are maybe unconscious to people when they're using these languages. But Hemingway was conscious of that, so he deliberately used. Uh,
Interesting.
I mean, the old man and the sea. Uh, Hemingway. I mean, every word is Anglo-Saxon there. Whereas Samuel Coleridge wrote The Ancient Mariner. Well, The Ancient Mariner is pure French, of course, but it means the same thing as The Old Man and the Sea. Uh, my point here is that both of these writers are writing in what we call modern English, but one of them is choosing French vocabulary, and the other is choosing Anglo-Saxon vocabulary. And so the distinction is still there. It's still there, but it's very subtle. And French has become so interwoven with Anglo-Saxon that we are today not conscious of our usage of one word versus the other. But they still have a very deep resonance, it seems to me, in terms of class consciousness, or I should say class unconsciousness.
In what way? So using French derived words
It
separates you in class
separates
to someone who's purely
because French
Anglo-Saxon?
was the language of the ruling class for hundreds
I
of
see.
years.
Okay.
The first several hundred years after the, the conquest of England, um, and that's the same thing true in modern Persian. The Arabic is associated with the old original ruling class, and and nativist movements in Persian are very consciously trying to use uh, authentic, Persian vocabulary and not Arabic vocabulary. Ferdowsi, one of the reasons that Ferdowsi is such a revered poet is precisely that he wrote the Shanahmeh deliberately, trying to minimize the Arabic vocabulary. People have estimated that something like between 5 and 10%, or not even, closer to 5 or 6%, of the vocabulary of the Shanahmeh is Arabic. The rest of it is all Persian. And that's very important because, when the Islamic Revolution came to Iran in 1979, almost all the statues in the city of Tehran were destroyed, except Ferdowsi. Because Ferdowsi is recognized at some level of consciousness as having preserved Persian from Arabic. I mean, Iran is one of the few countries whose language was preserved after the Arab conquest. You look at Egypt, you look at anywhere in Iraq, Syria, North Africa. The languages in those parts of the world were, if not extinguished, at least marginalized. You think of Syriac or Coptic; they still exist, or even Aramaic.
Mm.
They still exist, but they are very, very marginalized compared to Arabic. Whereas in Iran, Iran did manage to preserve its a great deal of its original language before the Arab conquest came. So that's a very important point.
And you think the Shanahmeh had a massive impact in that preservation?
Absolutely, no question about it. Oh yes, that's one of the reasons it did.
What?
Yes,
Why do you think it was so fundamental, apart from the language, as we've discussed? But do you think it's the
the
stories and
stories.
the
Oh
culture
yes,
embedded
the
within it?
stories are all celebrating historical as well as mythical Iranian heroes, pre-Islamic Iranian heroes. So, and it's about kingship. Uh, and the Shahnameh therefore served as a model for new peoples coming into the Middle East, like the Turks and the Mongols. When they arrive in the Middle East, they are assimilated into the Iranian world by being handed the Shahnameh as this is the book you need to read if you want to
Yeah.
understand how to rule these people. And of course, it was a model of proper rulership, among other things. Besides great stories, great literature, it was a model of how to rule. And Iran had a long tradition of imperial governance. So the Shahnameh therefore became something that was used. And I might say not just in Iran, but in India, uh, when new dynasties are established, for example, the Bahmani dynasty in the Deccan, the first book that was written, patronized by the founder of that dynasty, was a book entitled The Shahnameh Hind. That is to say, the Indian Shahnameh,
In Hindi. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
by Isami, the poet Isami. And he uses the same meter that Ferdowsi did in his Shahnameh. So the Shahnameh serves as a model from a literary standpoint for this Shahnameh Hind, but also from a political standpoint because it is a model for how to rule. When you have a new dynasty appearing in the Deccan Plateau, you now have a book which celebrates kingship and instructs kings on how to rule. So it's very important from both a linguistic standpoint and from a political standpoint.
Yeah, it seems like a way of initiation into the
Yes,
culture, in the sense that it gives some common
precisely.
ground for people, so that if you come in, you can
Yes,
read the book, and by reading the book, you embed yourself in the culture, and you can talk about these stories at dinner or while having something to drink, and it automatically puts you on the same
that's correct.
page. And what were some of the contributing factors then for that decline then in the Persianate Age in India during that time? Like, what was some of the contributing factors that resulted in that decline? And are we seeing sort of the remnants of that decline to this day?
Well, the decline, as we were talking about earlier, the rise of nationalism, in a sense, had the effect of narrowing the scope of the Persian language from this vast terrain stretching from Europe to Southeast Asia to simply the national frontiers of Iran. And also, I should say, Afghanistan and Tajikistan, because Persian, although it's called Dari there in Afghanistan, is still widely spoken and has great prestige, as well as Tajikistan, where it's still the vernacular languages. So it's not just Iran, but Iran is the big player here, and so yes, I think it was the rise of nationalism in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries that induced people to perceive Persian as a language that was more properly identified with just the nation state of Iran, as opposed to this vast world where everybody and anybody could buy into it. And you had for a long period of time, there were more Persian speakers in India than there were in Iran itself.
It seems as if the move to nationalism is a way to perhaps not change the history, but perhaps embed the stories that you want to say at that particular time rather than say what the shared culture is. Because we've had many historians on the podcast before, and it seems like a cultural thread or a thread between all of those books is this idea that we have a shared history, and it's that shared history that needs to be promoted rather than suggesting that each country sits in a silo. And it seems as if your book and the things that you've said in this podcast are exactly the same.
That's true. That's a very good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, and the word silo is a very good metaphor for what nations do. Nations have the effect of making everyone feel that they belong in one place only. And every nation state is very jealous about having their own flag, their own passport, their own national anthem, their own language, their own mythology, their own founding fathers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They all do the same. And that was not true.
Yeah,
That was not true in the 17th and 16th and 15th centuries.
Yeah, and that's why when people say to me, like, all the time, in the sense that there is progress in this world, and there is obviously progress in many things, technology wise, and with many things, but I almost think like in the past they had a much more open approach to dealing with new people, or in coming across new people, and being more open to hearing about stories. And I think at this moment, I think we're less in that space, and I think it's just a period of time. But when you read about history, like you're talking about the Shanahmeh and these types of things, that people were more open with sharing stories and listening to other people, and having these discussions and sharing books and ideas and these types of things. It's a very refreshing look at history, because I don't think many people think about that.
Well, yes, I agree with you. And I have to say, this goes back to the original point of our discussion and how I became interested in this topic, which is to say, I was assigned by Penguin UK, right in where you are in central London, to write a textbook. And I had to think about, how am I going to do this?
Yeah.
You know, and I initially thought of it as simply being a story from starts at 1000 and ends in 1800, and that was it. Until I happened to go to a dinner party of a colleague of mine here in Tucson, and the wife of this colleague asked me, who was not an historian, not an academic at all. She was simply trying to make small talk after dinner, at dessert time. And she said, "Oh, Dick, tell me, what is the argument of your book?" And I thought about it. I didn't think I had an argument, because I thought I was writing a textbook. And textbooks generally do not have an argument. They generally do not have a conclusion. They simply go from A to Z and stop. But I was worried. I was concerned about why I was not able to answer that question. And I thought about it. And after several days, I realized, there is an argument. And the argument is that our previous attempts to write South Asian history through the prism of Hindu-Muslim relations, as if we have these two blocks of people who are entirely separate, are in conflict with each other over hundreds of years. That whole model needs to be rethought. And fortunately, I had just read this book by Shelley Pollack about Sanskrit. So that is how I came to understand this idea of a Persianate world as being a very fruitful way of thinking about India, but not just India. As you rightly point out, the Persianate world was much larger than South Asia. It extended across this vast area and had profound influence on other cultures, especially Turkish, but also Southeast Asia as well.
Yeah, and the better that you understand that, I think the better you get an understanding about why attitudes towards the region in today's world. I think you need to understand that in order to get some sort of context to the current situation. But thank you so much, Richard, for coming onto the podcast and discussing this topic and obviously elements from your book, India and the Persianate Empire, from the year 1000 to 1765. Richard, where's the best place to individuals to find you if you do have a website or any social media?
I have no social media. I'm very hard.
That you're sensible. You're sensible.
I want to keep it that way.
It wasn't that hard for me to find you.
I'm glad you did. I'm very glad you did. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you today.
Yeah, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Likewise.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed this podcast with Richard. Like I said, it was enlightening to learn about how the Persianate Empire embedded itself into India's culture and how some of the repercussions from that can be seen to this day as well. So thank you to Richard for coming onto this podcast and discussing his book, India in the Persianate Empire, the years 1000 to 1765. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the podcast. Every week we release a podcast with an author to discuss their book, as well as the ideas and principles inside of it. We have some really interesting conversations lined up in the coming weeks, so I definitely recommend subscribing to the podcast, whether you're listening to this on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. The best way to support this channel is to head over to our YouTube channel and subscribe over there. Thank you again for listening to this podcast, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.